Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Namita Wahi. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research and director of the Land Rights Initiative. And on behalf of the Land Rights Initiative and the Center, I am very pleased to welcome all of you to the fifth talk in our Legal History Speaker Series. The Legal History Speaker Series is one of a series of events that we have launched or are going to launch in order to celebrate 10 years of work of the Land Rights Initiative and in the lead up to our 10-year anniversary, which is coming up next month. And the reason why we decided to do a series of talks on legal history is because all of our work, whether it is on land acquisition, land rights of scheduled tribes in the scheduled areas, property rights, health rights, water rights, forest rights, as well as our Mapping Indian Land Laws project, which is the first interactive exploratory archive of all land laws that have been enacted by the center and 8 states. In all of our work, we have adopted a legal historical approach to understand questions of policy in the present. And that is because even though there have been many transformative periods where there have been ruptures and radical reimaginations of the political, economic structure and the legal structure within which we are living, there are many continuities also between the colonial and the post-colonial period. We see that in our Mapping Indian Land Laws project, where we found that there are presently 500 laws relating to land on the website, of which 150 are colonial laws and 350 are post-colonial laws. And even though we have, for instance, within the liberal imagination, the adoption of the Indian Constitution was a transformative moment, was a radical departure from what was happening in the past, because that was the moment when Indians were transformed overnight from being subjects of the British Empire to citizens, right? And yet, many, because of the continuities with the colonial period, we find that there are often these sort of cycles of expansion and contraction that we see, and sort of this almost like a cycle of movement and forward and backwards movement on many issues that concern us. And you know, the fact that citizenship empowered us to now be governed by our representatives, as opposed to having no voice in our government before, for nearly 2 centuries of colonial rule. Suddenly, Indians, and the remarkable thing was that all Indians, the Indian Constitution adopted the principle of universal adult suffrage. It was pretty much the only constitution which from the very outset gave rights to everyone, including all women. At the time of, for example, the adoption of the US Constitution, not all people in the United States had the same rights. Even at the time of India's independence, all women in England did not have the right to vote, but all women in India and all Indians got the right to vote as soon as the Constitution was adopted. And in the first general elections that were held in 1951, all adult Indians were empowered and entitled to vote, to elect their representatives, right? And one of the most important things in democratic theory is the sort of transference of power, the use of elections to elect our representatives and to ensure that elections are held periodically so that power is not concentrated in the hands of any one group of people. So these principles are very well established, but at the same time, the procedures through which these principles are effectuated are not sufficiently well understood in the public imagination. And that is the goal of the legal history series, is that can we try and better understand the laws, both substantive and procedural, that govern our lives as citizens, including our right, the most basic right that comes from citizenship, which is representation, the fact that we have the power to elect our own representatives. And it is in that context that we have organized today's talk on One Nation, One Election, evaluating the history of electoral reforms in India. And just to give the context of why we are talking about this today is because under the Constitution, we have an independent body, the Election Commission of India, which has the power to conduct the procedure of elections, right? And to facilitate the conduct of elections by the Election of Commission of India, Parliament enacted the Representation of the People Act 1950 and 1951, and a series of delegated legislation was made pursuant to these laws to effectuate them, including the Registration of Electors Rules of 1960 and Conduct of Elections Rules of 1961. Pursuant to the Representation of People Act is when the first general elections were held, the general elections where all Indians were empowered to vote. And all state legislative assemblies also had their elections with the general elections in 1951 and 52. Now, that practice continued over three subsequent general elections held in the years 1952, 1962, and 1967. However, due to the premature dissolution of some legislative assemblies in 1968 and 69, the cycle got disrupted for the first time in 1970. The fourth Lok Sabha itself was dissolved prematurely and elections were held in 1971. So for the first 20 years of when we became a republic, we had one nation, one election. And then over the next 50 years, we did not have simultaneous elections. Since 2017, the Niti Aayog and the NDA government have proposed a return to simultaneous elections, highlighting that these asynchronous elections in India negatively impact administrative and developmental activities in the poll-bound states or regions and the larger governance process in general. It is also noted by the Niti Aayog, as well as there have been some law commission reports on the subject, that holding simultaneous elections will bring about tremendous cost savings for political parties and the government. Because Indian elections are obviously a costly affair. We are 1.4 billion people. Most of our population is young, and we have a significant percentage of our population above the age of 18. And even though we've had stringent campaign finance regulations in India since 1951, since the Representation of People Act, campaign funding has remained opaque, and the regulations have historically been observed only in the breach. It was to tackle this opaque nature of election funding that the government also introduced the Electoral Bond Scheme in 2017, ostensibly to bring about transparency in electoral funding. But this scheme was itself struck down earlier this year by the Supreme Court as violative of the voters' right to information about political funding under Article 19(1)(a) of the Constitution and for undermining electoral democracy in India. So against this, history, this long arc of going from one nation, one election to not having that for 50 years, and now a conversation about going back to that, and the fact that, campaign finance has been an issue throughout, the 70 years history, and recent reform attempts to solve this problem have also not yielded to any outcome. In fact, we are back to square one in that sense. So against this contentious backdrop of electoral reforms in India, it is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome back to CPR Chakshu Roy, who is the head of legislative and civic engagement at PRS Legislative Research. PRS is a unique institution that provides non-partisan research support to national and state legislators in India. More than 400 legislators at the national level and 1,000+ legislators across 25 states regularly reach out to PRS for research on legislative and policy issues. Chakshu is also, he's an expert on legislative functioning and parliamentary procedures, and over the last 2 decades, he has anchored legislative strengthening programs for legislators and parliamentary staff nationally and internationally. He writes about issues related to laws in the Indian Parliament and speaks regularly about, these laws and demystifies them for Sansad TV and Doordarshan. And he has also conceptualized and developed India's pioneering online database of all state laws and has conducted capacity building workshops for over 1,000 journalists on tracking the work of legislators. Before joining PRS, Chakshu worked as a lawyer, specializing in real estate law, commercial contracts, and corporate law, and holds bachelor's degrees in commerce and law from Delhi University. He was also an Inc. Fellow in 2010. And to that introduction, I will add my personal introduction because I owe PRS a huge debt of gratitude, partly because, so when I first came to CPR to work at PRS Legislative Research, and that was my first PRS had sort of started out only a few years before, but it was already, it was a pioneering attempt to try and provide more support to MPs. And my first assignment when I worked at PRS was to work on a paper on campaign finance regulation. And so wonderful it was to be at PRS and to work with Chakshu and other colleagues that, I came to CPR and I never left after that. 17 years later, we are still here. And, welcoming you back to CPR, although it feels you never really left. So without further ado, I turn over the floor to you and I look forward to hearing you demystify the issues that are at stake in One Nation, One Election and in election finance, as well as anything else that you think we need to think about as citizens of India.
Thank you, Namita. Thank you for,
I don't know if it's working.
inviting me to the history series that the Land Rights Initiative has started. And I think it's extremely useful to think of issues from a historical lens, uh, because it is perhaps from understanding the context in how something was done back in the day. Do we understand as to what were the pulls and the pressures, and perhaps also learn from it and see as to if something requires changing. And this room has seen many distinguished people come and talk about elections, so I don't think I can beat that. But I can perhaps tell a few stories, and hopefully that's going to be a little less boring, this afternoon than me trudging through sections and clauses of the People's Representation Act and the Constitution of India. And also, I was never a very good student, so my command on the subject is only through stories. So let's start even before the first general elections took place in India. And as Namita pointed out in her opening remarks, there is a little bit of a colonial legacy that is associated with our elections. The first elections, or the first, quote unquote, broad-based, if you want to call it that, the first broad-based elections happened after the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. Now, these elections were as a result of the fact that there was a lot of public pressure on increasing the representation of Indians in the legislative system in India. And one way to do that was have an election, and instead of having nominated members to these legislatures, have elected members. But the British administration possibly also was not equipped, right? I mean, I'd rather not go into the intent, but perhaps was not equipped to have an electoral process which was all-encompassing, which means everybody had the right to vote and everybody had the right to contest elections. So what they did was they limited the way they put the qualifying criteria so much that the number of candidates who could stand for election, reduced, and the qualifying criteria for people who could vote was also quite high. So the voting population was also quite low. To give you an example, in the New Delhi constituency in 1920, and you would realize that by 1920, Delhi had become the capital of our colonial administrators. So there was a seizable population in Delhi. The voting population, I think, for New Delhi was 3,300. And obviously, Indian nationalists were trying to ensure that that's the first election of 1920 was not a big success. So there were calls to boycott the election. There was also an attempt to ensure that candidates who could potentially be, quote unquote, ridicule candidates could be put up and made to win. So the gentleman who won from India was nobody of, of a big repute or a big political personality. He was possibly a halwai, and got about 200 odd votes and defeated a couple of lawyers who were also contesting. But this election of 1920 set across a couple of different things, right? I mean, it talked about the fact as to how bribing a voter or influencing a voter or trying to coerce a voter is going to be a crime. And it was incorporated into the Indian Penal Code. And some of those provisions continue even till today, almost exact the same language. Uh, the question of electoral expenditure, what a candidate can spend in an election, is also a colonial legacy. Back in the day, I think in one of the elections after the 1935 Constitution, the electoral expenditure was set at about 3,000 rupees for a candidate who was going to contest an election. Uh, then, we become independent, and we, as a newly created nation, there's this immense responsibility on the Election Commission of India to conduct elections. And as Namita pointed out, now everybody had that electoral franchise. 21 years of age is all that required for you to be, to cast your vote. Anybody also stand up for election. So the number of candidates also increased. And in fact, there was some back and forth between the Prime Minister, Nehru, and the election commissioner at that time, where the discussion was, can the elections be held early? And, the election commissioner said that just to create the electoral roll in a decent format would take long time. Now, when you're thinking back to that first election, also think of the fact as to what the country was going through at that point of time. This was a time of great strife. We had just been divided. There were people moving across. People didn't have papers. How do you get women to enroll when many of them did not, quote unquote, have uh, a separate identity as an individual? So there were all of these challenges, and the election commission was then tasked in making sure that election happens. Uh, and I was looking through some notes, and since one of the things that we wanted to talk about today is money, uh, in the first elections, general elections, there were two kinds of constituencies. There were single member constituencies and there were double member constituencies. And the expenditure limit in that election was 25,000 rupees for a single member constituency and 35,000 rupees for a dual member constituency. And to give you a sense that this 25,000 rupees would have still been a very significant amount of money at that point of time. So elections happen. There's a whole range of, and elections are celebrated. They're free and fair, and then that sets us on this path uh, of uh, of democracy, which is characterized by free and fair elections and a smooth transfer of power. Now, when the question of election expenditure was coming up, should we have election expenditure? Should we not have election expenditure? I'm going to read a little bit of a quote uh, from a parliamentary debate. And a member of parliament, when the People's Representation Act of 1951 was being debated in the House, in Lok Sabha, a member of parliament stood up and he said, in such a poor country as ours, with a very low standard of living, the money spent on elections should be rigidly curtailed. That alone will offer equality of opportunity to qualified and meritorious candidates who have not the support derived from wealth. The spirit, and the member went on to say that, the electoral expenditure or the ceiling on what you could spend would ensure a level playing field for candidates. And you would think that the system would work well. I think the first two elections, the electoral ceiling for what candidates could spend was set at 25,000 rupees. But by the third general elections, the Election Commission realized that elections are an expensive affair, and the ceiling on expenditure was not really working out. Now, if you look at the information produced by the Election Commission of India, there is one piece of information as to who won, who lost, who got how many votes. But they also have a wonderful document, and as researchers, it might interest most of you, is they have a narrative report about the elections. And part of what the narrative report covers is as to what were the steps that the Election Commission took prior to the election, what is the kind of preparation that they did, and then what went well, what were opportunities for learning. So they cover that. Now, after the third general elections in 1962, the narrative report of the Election Commission of India said the legal provision relating to election expenses as they stand at present are of no use and call for drastic amendments or total repeal. This is 1962. As far back as 1962, we realized that the ceiling on expenditure is not really working out. And currently, the ceiling on expenditure for a parliamentary constituency for a large state is 95 lakh rupees. For an assembly constituency, I think it is about 75 lakh rupees, and subject to correction, but 95 lakhs for a big parliamentary constituency. But if you think that this was sudden, it was not. There were a number of intervening things which pointed out that money and muscle power were, getting into our electoral process. Uh, and uh, and and one initial indication that came out was a case in the Bombay High Court, wherein a shareholder of Tisco took the Tata Iron and Steel Company, Tisco. A shareholder of Tisco took Tisco to court because Tisco was trying to amend its memorandum of association. So companies have a memorandum of association, article of association, where they basically lay out as to what is it that the company is going to do as part of its business activities. And Tisco was trying to change its memorandum of association to say that funding of political parties or donating to political parties would be part of its mandate of activities. And this shareholder said that this can't be a mandate for a political party to be for a company to be supporting political parties. So the case went to the High Court. Justice Changla, who was the Chief Justice of the High Court then, he would later become a member of parliament and serve as minister in Nehru's cabinet. Justice Changla ruled that no, the company could amend its memorandum of association, but he also laid down certain strictures. He said that the company had to declare as to how much money they were giving to a particular party in their annual accounts. So this was one indication that corporate support in elections was going to happen and was going to happen in a formal manner. So far, there were always these conversations that, there were certain corporate houses which were supporting certain political parties, so on and so forth. But the Tisco case really brought out the fact that companies were thinking of formal mechanism of supporting political parties. But formal mechanisms were not the only mechanisms. The next possible indication that came out was that there was a Rajya Sabha election in Bihar in 1964. Now, till 1964, we had almost a single party government all across the country, both at the federal level and at the state level. And the Congress party had a decent kind of a hold on its MPs and MLAs. So Rajya Sabha elections were a very safe mechanism to get somebody elected to parliament. And in this particular election in Bihar, the Congress candidate thought that they would be able to sail through because they had the requisite number of members in the Legislative Assembly. But what happened was that there was a businessman who entered the fray, and there was a member of the Congress party that cross-voted. Uh, the aggrieved person who lost the Rajya Sabha election then went to court. And this gentleman was able to prove that money had exchanged hands by the businessman who had won and the member of Legislative Assembly who had cross-voted. So as early as 1964, we started getting to realize that uh, elections are not as pure as we were thinking. And obviously, the Election Commission had already made it clear that direct elections were getting tainted, and here now we had evidence that indirect elections to Rajya Sabha were also getting tainted. After that, things moved very quickly politically. So I think if we look at the history of India, 1967 is a watershed year where uh, politically things changed quite a bit. Even within the Congress party, regional players started coming up. And that is when there was a step that was taken by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, where uh, she deleted a provision of the Companies Act, uh, which was being used by companies to contribute to political parties. So that was step one. And there were a couple of other consequential steps that happened a couple of years later. One of them was there was apprehension of foreign intervention in our elections. So Foreign Contribution Regulation Act also came in, and one of the provisions of that was that uh, if political parties could not accept money from outside of the country, neither could candidates, and even accepting of hospitality and a couple of other things from foreign sources was banned. But if you look at it, so far, what I've talked about is about individual candidates, the ceiling on their expenditure, uh, uh, and they winning or losing elections. And I've spoken very little about the political party side of it. Now, after the formal legal mechanism was removed, there are a number of academics who have pointed out that the system became a little informal. So rather than contributing to the political party itself, what individual politicians or political parties started doing was they started coming out with these magazines or volumes or uh, speeches in the form of booklets in which they sought advertisement. So rather than contribute to the political party, you would buy an advertisement in a commemorative volume and then you pay a certain amount of money. But there's another interesting development happened, which was that while there was a cap on election expenditure by individual candidates, there was no cap on election expenditure by political parties. And that changed in 1974. What happened was that a candidate who lost went to court and basically said that my rival candidate had a support of the political party because people had come and campaigned. And the Supreme Court, uh, in its judgment, held that that if a candidate derives an advantage in their elections by campaign done by the political party, then the amount of money that is spent by the political party will be added to the election expenditure of that individual candidate and then would be subject to whatever the ceiling on expenditure is. Now, this changed the game completely because political parties till that time could bypass the election expenditure, ceiling on expenditure route by uh, spending themselves rather than the candidate spending and hitting that limit. Now, whenever things like this happen, political parties unite. And one of the things that came out of the Supreme Court judgment was that Parliament enacted a law which basically nullified the Supreme Court judgment and said that political parties were free to spend the money. And this situation would change much, much later. Uh, through the ups and downs of uh, elections and politics, then comes 1985. We have Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, who comes into the governance scene. And during his tenure, two or three very interesting things happen. One, obviously, the voting age goes down. So it comes down from 21 to 18, uh, which is uh, uh, while it gets more people onto the electoral rolls, what it also does is it increases the burden of representation. So an MP now has to reach many more people to convince them to, get their support at that during the time of elections. That then consequently translates to the fact that it needs more money to now campaign, because you have that many more people to reach out to. And I'm not saying that this is linked, but what Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's government does is that the ban that was put in on corporates contributing to political parties in 1969 is removed by Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's when he comes into power. But his government also within the first year does a very interesting thing. Uh, they change the nature of what it means to be a public representative. So far, public representatives uh, they wore two hats. They wore a hat where they were representing the people who elected them, and they were representatives of the political parties who gave them the ticket. Uh, 1985 saw the 10th schedule of the Constitution getting added. The 10th schedule, as you know, is the anti-defection law. And what it roughly says is that if a candidate gets elected on the ticket of a political party, he or she has to abide by the directions of the political party in terms of voting in parliament and how they express themselves in and outside of parliament. And so what it really did was that it tightened the control of the political party on their MPs. And it basically meant that if you violated the party, uh, not only would you lose your seat in the House, but if you crossed the party in any other form or crossed the party's high command in any other form, your chances of getting a political party's ticket in the next election became bleak. And by this time, in our electoral journey, what had become clear was that if you fought the election as an independent, you would be at a disadvantage. Because if you see the number of independents, they started tapering off at the uh, also because political parties could spend that much more money in support of the candidates that they gave tickets to. So let me stop at 1985 for one or two reasons. One, because I think it's a good point to stop. And also because when we think of elections, we only think of elections as the direct elections. There are many other elections that happen in this country. So for example, one election that happens is the election to the President of India. Now, I'm not sure if you noticed, but during this election, there were a number of candidates who tried to file their nomination or were able to file their nomination from Varanasi because they wanted their name on the ballot against the Prime Minister. Now, for the first, I think, 15, 16 years in our presidential elections, the law really provided that anybody could be on the ballot for the election to the president, which meant that at one point of time, there were like 17 people. I think 14 of those got like no votes, were on the ballot to become the, contest the election to the President of India. So there was some tightening of that provision, and now the law was changed that you now had to secure the support of 50 members of parliament or an X number of MLAs to be able to file your nomination to the presidential election. So there were some of these changes, but roughly the electoral law progressed without too many changes. 1985 was the change wherein the electronic voting machines. So that was the other change that came out, I think 86 or 87, when the People's Representation Act was changed and electronic voting machines could be used in elections. Uh, After that, we've had tweaks, we have changes, but the electoral law has roughly remained the same. There has been one change, which is, so for example, in the first elections, I think Atal Bihari Vajpayee contested from 3 parliamentary constituencies. So if you see, there's a by-election to Wayanad that's happening because the leader of the opposition contested from 2 places. He had to vacate 1 seat. Now, that position changed in the late 90s. Till the late 90s, you could contest from 3, 4, places. But that meant that if you won at one place, you'd have to vacate. If you won at multiple places, you had to vacate those seats, and then by-elections would have to be held. So Parliament tweaked that law and said, oh, you know what? Now the maximum places that you could contest from were 2. But as I said, the election process is not only for Lok Sabha, it is also for Rajya Sabha. And while there was money and muscle power in Lok Sabha elections, money and muscle power also started increasing in Rajya Sabha elections. And Rajya Sabha elections technically are supposed to be extremely safe elections. If your party gives you the ticket, then usually you win the election uncontested, because the parties know the calculation that if there are 3 Rajya Sabha seats opening up from a state, which party will get how many seats. So that is the number of candidates who file their nomination, and then they win unopposed. But the fact that MLAs could be enticed to cross vote meant that there were candidates who were willing to file their nomination and force a contest, and then hope that they would be able to persuade some MLAs to cross vote. And that happened in the late 90s quite a bit. And again, Parliament stepped in and basically said that Rajya Sabha elections will no longer be by secret ballot. So in 2002, I think, or 2001, 2002, that law was changed. So Rajya Sabha elections are now an open ballot election, which means that if you're an MLA and you're going to vote in the Rajya Sabha election, your party's representative will be sitting there, and you have to show your voting slip as to how you are voting. Now, the only thing or the saving grace in this process was that members of parliament, a few members of parliament and Rajya Sabha challenged this law in the Supreme Court. And the court held that open ballot is legal, it's fair, but it said that parties should not be able to issue a whip to their MLAs because they said that voting in a Rajya Sabha election is not part of the legislative process. So whips can only be issued for the legislative process, but you can't issue a whip for this. Now, the idea was that an open ballot would mean that party candidates would not be able to sail through because party would penalize if you cross-voted. But the lure of money and the lure of possible future gains meant that MLAs continue to cross-vote. So even if you see now in the last few years, there are there are candidates who have contested elections and they have lost. And I think I'm just about out of time, so I should stop. Uh, and uh, and when Namita was making her opening remarks, she mentioned a few things that what is history thought of in terms of when it comes to elections. So one is clearly as to the role of money in electoral process. That's a big question that was as burning when we had our first elections as it is now. That's one. I think second is the kind of campaign, that happens. And I want to close by reading out to you that uh, in 1920, Edwin Montagu, who was uh, famous for the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. So he said that the honest education of the electorate is a matter of primary importance. May one who take an anxious interest in India's future echo the appeal that there should be no appeal to racial or religious prejudices and express the hope that in the turmoil of an election, the great charm of Indian courtesy may not disappear. And I think that's something that's relevant even today in terms of the tone and the tenor of elections that take place. So I'll stop here and hopefully that gives us some time for questions.
There's a lot in what you've said, and I think you've extensively covered campaign finance. Anti-defection law is, of course, something that, as soon as I arrived in PRS, that was an assignment that I was given to look at as to the anti-defection law, because that is the law which prevents an individual MP from representing the people as opposed to following the party line. And we can go into more details about the anti-defection law if time permits. But I wanted to hear from you about the whole discussion on one nation, one election, because there has been a lot of noise. But can you shed some light on, is it like, what are the issues that we should be thinking about? Like, we had that for 20 years, we didn't have it for 50 years. Why is it something which is leading to a polarization in the political parties as well, as to whether we should have it or not? And there is that whole discourse at the political party level, but for individual citizens, what is it that is at stake in this entire conversation?
See, I think let's step back. If you look at 52 to 67, when elections, quote unquote, were synced, uh, they were not synced by statute. They were synced because there were governments that completed their term. It so happened that when a country starts, there's a starting point. Everybody went to elections at the same time. And since everybody completed their tenure at the same time, the elections were held. So that's one part of it. I think the second part of it is what is the purpose of elections? Is the purpose of elections to bring efficiency in governance, or is the purpose of elections to get a free and fair insight into the minds of the voting electorate? According to me, the purpose of elections is to do the latter, which is it has nothing to do about efficiency. It has nothing to do about money spent. It is more about the fact, can we ensure that we are able to get more and more people to participate in the electoral process and find out as to who their representative is going to be. So that's the second part. I think the third part is that in a country where we have both elections which are direct and indirect, there might be a cascading impact that direct elections will have on an indirect election. So, for example, let's take Rajya Sabha. So, Rajya Sabha members have a 6-year term. They retire by rotation. And then they get elected. And every time, so Rajya Sabha elections don't happen in one go, right? I mean, they have this rotational kind of a feature. And what it allows is for the fact that Rajya Sabha elections then give you like a dipstick analysis of what the political environment in the country is that particular point of time. General elections are at a 5-year interval. Rajya Sabha elections are at a 2-year interval. So every 2 years in some part of the country, there will be a Rajya Sabha election or a couple of different states. And depending on what happened in that state elections will then reflect the composition of Rajya Sabha. And Rajya Sabha is supposed to be a house that tempers Lok Sabha, or is that saucer that cools down the tea, uh, as the Americans would say. So that's the other cascading. If you have a one nation, one election, what happens to the spirit for the Rajya Sabha process? That's the other thing to think about. And one, uh, and perhaps perhaps we need to find a solution to the fact that in the democratic system that we have, uh, the executive is responsible to the legislature, which means the government needs to maintain a majority. Now, if that is the cornerstone of how our democracy is built, then imagine a scenario where there is a state that has gone to election and started its process of its legislative assembly. 3 years down the line or 2 years down the line, the government loses the majority, right? Then should they be allowed to run the other remaining part of the tenure as a caretaker, or will another government come in? What should that arrangement be? Technically, if you don't have the support of the legislature, or if you don't have the majority in the legislature, you should resign and make space for the next person who would want to form the government or has the ability to form the government. If nobody comes across, then elections should happen. If that is a fundamental ethos of as to how our democracy works, if we want to change that, how would that function? I think that's a question that we should ask ourselves.
Yes. Okay. So you have answered the first question that I got on Zoom, which was about, whether it is even feasible to hold. Do you think it's, so you answered more or less what the question was about one nation, one election, but is it feasible to hold that? You've explained that we're never going to really be able to do it with the indirect elections. But for the direct elections, is it feasible to hold?
I think it's a so I wish this was a question that I could answer. And the reason I say that is because sometimes the election commission requires more time or more number of phases to hold a state election. So then it is a question of resources, to what is the kind of resources that they would need. If the last general election was held in 7 phases, then all general elections and all state elections have to be done together. What's the kind of resource that we are looking at, and would that be efficient enough, or will we have the ability to do that? So I think maybe a question for the election commission to think about and answer.
Right. Are there any other questions? Yeah, Durgesh.
Hello, sir. I'm Durgesh. So, okay, before I go ahead with the question, I just want to clarify that this is not necessarily my personal opinion, but just a fact which is there. Well, not a fact, but an opinion or possibility which is raised by many people. So I sort of would like to maybe know your opinion. Or when it said that we should have one nation and like one election for the whole country at once, there are critics who point out that a state might choose, like the people of a state might choose to vote for a certain party to form the government at the state level, but a different party at the central level. But when you have the elections, simultaneously, there's obviously an information asymmetry which is there, which is a common thing which we often see with elections. So in that case, people say that there might be some amount of I mean, the practice of having elections simultaneously can affect how people are voting in that sense. Not necessarily change their opinion, but make it more difficult for everyone to comprehend. Of course, some people might be more aware of the whole process, but not everyone. So, just maybe your thoughts on this, like this possibility which is raised by some people.
Yeah, my question is like, yeah, my name is Megha Chakravarti and I'm from University of Delhi and currently I'm in master's final year. So my question is, as we see one nation, one election, so it signifies a sense of uniformity. And when we see uniformity, so how does it compromises the democratic values? And when there's a uniformity, again, there's a sense of a dominant rule which will prevail. Because if we see from the local perspective and the state assemblies elections, there will be the people may be influenced or guided by the cult figure at the central level. So that's my question.
Hi, I'm Priyanshu, and I'm also a master student from University of Delhi. My question is, as PRS has done a lot of work on the kind of disruption and the legislative and the legislatures are actually working, my question would be, how do you see that impacting the legislative functioning and therefore the environment there? Because the kind of candidate that we are having in the kind of setup that we are kind of elections that we are having has certain impact. So how do you think that one nation one election would have at both levels, one at the national assembly level and also at the Lok Sabha level and therefore the Rajya Sabha as well?
Uh, Thank you, Durgesh, Meera, if I got your name right, and Meena. Okay, Megha. I'm so sorry. Thank you, Megha and Priyanshi. I think all of your questions are possibly the same question. The words might be different, right? And I wish, uh, I wish I was as erudite and informed as everybody who has come and taken this place. I'll try my best to answer what I can. So let's first, and I say this with all uh, all regard for the political parties, but let's think of political parties in two different senses. One is political parties as vehicles of social change, right? And second, as political parties whose focus is to win an election. Now, political parties can wear both hats. They do wear both hats. And Priyanshi, to your point about the fact as to the kind of candidates that political parties choose, I think political parties choose candidates who win, irrespective of who you or me or the rest of us would want to think. And that somehow explains as to the kind of individuals who come to parliament or to the state legislative assemblies. So more moneyed candidates who have more foot on the ground, more muscle, whichever way you want to say this. So will one nation, one election change that? Uh, I don't have an answer to that, but what I do know is that I don't think political parties will change their candidate selection criteria depending on the type of election. I think their candidate selection criteria will be, will Priyanshi win an election or not? If not, then it does not make a difference as to whether it was one nation or whether it was a spread out election. So that's one part of it. Uh, Durgesh and Megha, to your point, uh, is uh, I have a lot of faith in the Indian voter. And perhaps the reason for that is that uh, very often they've proved the agencies who conduct the the polling predictions wrong. Now, I think what what we need to really think about is not only about the election process, but what is it that we are doing in terms of ensuring that our voters are better informed. So currently, the way we have looked at voters is that Election Commission has this great focus on ensuring that the voting percentage rises. So, and I could be wrong about this. So, a lot of the attempt is towards uh, once in a 5-year push to ensure that whether it is for state elections or for national elections, the voting percentage rises. But perhaps we as a country need to also shift track and think about engagement with our public representatives as a round the year phenomena, right? Not in a once in a year that, oh, you know what, I voted and put my, inked finger on Instagram, but a much more involved process where we are engaging on dialogue, on laws that are getting passed or discussions that is taking place. Currently, we have simplified it to a very simple extent, which is, oh, you know what, come cast your vote, your duty is done. But perhaps that duty needs to be redefined or reframed as to what it really means to be a voter or a good voter, which is uh, where you know the candidate, where you've engaged with candidates, or the views that the candidate has or how the candidate has represented you. The other part of it is that we also need to possibly think about whether so at least in my opinion, there will never be a foolproof mechanism to control electoral expenditure. People will still be able to spend way more money than what the Election Commission says, and Election Commission, I don't think, will be able to fully control or enforce the limits. And some people attribute this quote to, I think, Atal Bihari Vajpayee. I haven't been able to find an authoritative text which says this, but many politicians say this quite openly in Delhi, which is that an elected member, whether an MLA or an MP, they start their journey as a lawmaker with a lie when they sign that affidavit that this is the amount of money that I spent on the election. Right. So if you want to think about the fact that as to whether one nation, one election will change that, possibly not. But perhaps if we shifted the focus from the election to how we think about voters and the responsiveness of voters and the engagement of voters with the process, then that could be another start. Because the political process of ensuring as to what kind of elections do we have will happen, but that should not limit the conversation around voter engagement or making sure that voters understand as to what is at stake when it comes to elections.
Take maybe 3 more questions.
My name is D.K. Singh. I was teaching in Punjab University. Now, yeah, I was teaching in Punjab University. Now I'm in Delhi. I would like to make 1 or 2 points. One is that what is the possibility of this one nation, one election, this whole thing is to be implemented in next 3 to 5 years or 10 years if the BJP and other parties, they pursue it. And how will this be implemented? Will it be implemented through the parliament or through the legislative assemblies? And 3, there is a discussion, or there is a kind of supportive argument, and perhaps very logical one, that the cost of administration in all the states and the center in implementing various policies for the welfare of the people, it gets affected because the IS officers, they get transferred from one state to another every 2 years, 3 years, and the state suffers in implementing those policies. So these 3 points I would like to make. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Shyam Babu, a senior fellow at CPR. I'm sorry again, same one nation, one election. Don't you think of adopting this one nation, one election would in a way de facto make us some kind of a presidential system because it would do away with legislative control over the government? My second question, this point you did not touch, but I think it is relevant, which is Rajya Sabha no longer works as a house of the states because many members elected from different assemblies don't even live there.
Thank you, sir. My name is Kartar Kapoor. I'm a student of Comparative Studies in Evolution of Histories. Sir, my humble submission is this point has not been discussed at all. One nation, one election. Would it be a disaster or not? That is a question. To be or not to be. We are all for it, one nation, one election. What's so good about one nation, one election? The smaller party will always be at a disadvantage because the resources that is required to fight an election are immense with the ruling party, whatsoever that party may be. I'm not for any party, so to say. I'm saying whosoever is in power have all the resources to go for it, and they will be always the winner. Whereas the smaller party will never get a chance to rise in the national affairs. They will never come up. So I would say, would it be fair to have one nation, one election? Second, it would be unjust not to go for one nation, multi-elections.
Thank you.
Multi-elections is essential for the democracy, sir.
Thank you. So we'll take those three questions.
Okay, so how will one nation, one election happen? I wish somebody knew. Currently, I don't think there is a consensus as to what are the kind of legislative / constitutional changes that are required. So that is one. There are different, there are some reports that say that concurrence of state legislatures will be needed. There are others which do not mention that, they sidestep that point. So I am currently in no position to say as to, what, or I don't think, I don't speak on behalf of the government, but from whatever material is currently available in the public domain, I don't think there is a consensus on the fact as to what is the step-by-step mechanism. I know the President Kovind's report has mentioned a mechanism, but there are some places where there are disagreements as to what that mechanism and how that mechanism would be and how long would it take to roll out. The other part is as to, and this is alluded to in different ways, and Kapoor Saab, you're talking about it, Singh Saab, you're also talking about it, which is how do you think of elections wherein the elections achieve the desired outcome and keep the undesired outcome, which is the stalling of perhaps the governance part, which very often people talk about. There are some easy solutions. There are some, difficult conversations to be had, but perhaps governance does not really need to come to a standstill when elections are happening. Only what is it that we want in a free and fair election? In any free and fair election, what you really want is that the incumbent government should not be able to use its position as it is conducting the election to sway the voter onto their side. So whatever money or programs that have started, which they've already got the mandate through Parliament for, should continue. And they should not be allowed to announce new programs or new benefits as part of government. I think that's the limited purpose of what the model code of conduct should do. But perhaps the model code of conduct now, goes a little bit beyond, and banks are told not to, do something, and somebody else is told not to do something. We might need to relook that. But would it be fair to say, can you ensure that governance does not get disrupted when elections are happening? I think there is a mechanism to do that, and perhaps one nation, one election could be one, but there are other mechanisms that can be implemented without getting into changing laws or changing the constitution. Shyam, I think you raised a very interesting point about Rajya Sabha. I think, and this is my personal opinion, with an open ballot for a Rajya Sabha election and no domicile requirement for contesting a Rajya Sabha election, we really need to question as to whether Rajya Sabha is a council of states or Rajya Sabha is a council of political parties. Because these two steps combined together really changes the nature of Rajya Sabha. And so far, Supreme Court hasn't guided us in this particular aspect. And to add, if you look at the latest Supreme Court judgment vis-a-vis Rajya Sabha elections, Supreme Court has now shifted its position to say that political parties can now issue a whip for Rajya Sabha elections. Now, what will that mean for the composition and the nature of the functioning of Rajya Sabha? I think we need to really seriously debate that. Kapoor Sahab, to your question of the fact as to elections being an expensive affair and parties or individuals with limited resources having a disadvantage, I completely agree with you.
And cadre and cash. Cadre and cash. They don't have so much cadre, they don't have so much cash. How they're going to fight the big battle?
So, and this is where I would suggest that all of us should stop being naive about political financing. I don't think many Indians are members of a political party. Political parties also need funds to work, and their funds can either come in an organized manner from a source like a corporate, or it can come from subscriptions that are paid by individuals like you and me. So if we are going to be naive and think that we are not going to engage in the political process, and we are not going to work, as members of a political party or, have an active political life, and hope that, a young upstart or somebody from this room to fight an election, I think that's a little bit of a dichotomous situation. For a nation to have a vibrant election, the nation has to engage in that electoral process. It cannot shake its hands off and say, this is an expensive affair and, it is left to the political parties. If that is going to be the case, then yes, the political party that is in power will attract more support, and the political party which is in opposition will attract lesser support. And that is always the case. And we have seen it in the past, we'll see it now, and we'll see it in the future as well. So the solution to this would be to ensure as to how do we, as society, take a slightly more active interest in the political affairs. And I'll just highlight this in one small way. The age or the qualifying age to fight elections in this country is 25 years, correct? The ceiling for electoral expense that you can incur in a MP constituency is between 75 to 95 lakhs. Please tell me as to where will we find young, conscientious individuals who have 75 to 95 lakh rupees to spend to fight an election.
He can start his own business with 95.
Well, hopefully they'll start their own business or they'll build cadre strength. So those are things that we need to think about. I don't think there are any easy answers that I can provide here.
We have a lot of questions from our audience who have also been patiently listening. There were some multiple repeated questions that you have addressed on the feasibility as well as the advantages and disadvantages of conducting one nation, one election. So I won't repeat those questions, but there are some other questions. One is about the credibility of the Election Commission of India. The questioner is asking that given that the credibility of the Election Commission of India is not what it was, if it ever was, who do you think can build consensus across the political spectrum, given that NDA is not very strong when it comes to numbers for one nation, one election? And like with the questions in the room, I'll just say 2 or 3 questions at once. The second question is, how will one nation, one election change the political regional discourse with the North-South divide relative to the national political discourse? Do you want to take these 2 or should I continue? Yeah. The third question is, considering the way the entire administrative machinery and the political leadership is involved in elections, will not a simultaneous exercise create the reverse problem that it would create a dangerous vacuum in governance, especially law and order, which is sort of like turning on the head the idea that, which has been put out in the Niti Aayog paper and so on, that actually this is important for governance. The questioner is asking, won't it like put too much of a burden and create a vacuum in governance?
So there are certain institutional mechanisms that we should think about when it comes to anything in our country, and maybe I'm being a little bit more generalistic. Over the years, what we have done is we have placed our faith in individuals and not in institutions. And what I mean by that is that whenever we talk about the past and the present, we talk about individuals of the past and sometimes compare them to either individuals in the present or institutions in the present. So there was perhaps an election commissioner which was much more vigilant in the past, and perhaps we compare to current office bearers. But that's where I think we need to rethink the way we think about our institutions. We shouldn't think about our institutions as individuals or individuals who occupy those positions. If we are going to talk about the Election Commission of India, we should think about Election Commission of India as an institution and what are the procedural safeguards that that institution needs, irrespective of the institutions that will come there. And one part of that is, and this is something that we haven't addressed, is I think the Supreme Court's currently looking at the appointment process for election commissioners. Parliament had recently passed a law tweaking that process. The Supreme Court's looking at that. So the appointment process is a key part of it. I think another key part which we have neglected for a very long time is what is the kind of human resource that Election Commission requires. It conducts the biggest election in the world, but I think the strength of the Election Commission is about 300, 400 people. So possibly it requires an augmentation in terms of its human resource requirements. And then I think the budget of the Election Commission of India is charged, right? And if you look at other institutions, which are constitutional institutions and stuff, their budget is not, and maybe I'm making a small mistake in the terminology, but other constitutional institutions, their budgets, they are not voted upon in Parliament. They're straight away passed. So that gives them that much more quote unquote autonomy. And that's not really the case with the Election Commission of India. So possibly that is another thing that we need to think about. So possibly, that is my way of thinking about the Election Commission of India. I think that we haven't invested enough in the procedural safeguards that we need to think about when it comes to elections. So possibly one part there. I think we can have this debate over and over again, and till the time we don't hear the answer that we want to hear, we can keep raising these questions. Will simultaneous elections bring efficiency, not bring efficiency? Will they create a governance vacuum? Will they not create a governance vacuum? I don't think there are any easy answers to give. And all of these answers require perhaps an extremely in-depth study before we, get on with that process. President Cowen's committee has done a fair bit of work on that. Can that work be built upon to figure out as to what is going to be the cost of one nation, one election, how much, in terms of the human resources that will require, or the resources that we require in terms of logistics, just the number of machines that we might need. What will it mean for our strategic goals when elections are happening at that particular point of time? Will it delay implementation of some things? Will it speed up something? So those are things that we shouldn't do on a knee-jerk basis. I think we should sit down, and we are sitting in an institution which has always championed the idea of evidence-based policy. And a step that has such huge ramifications should have as much evidence to come and support it one way or the other would be required. On the north-south divide, maybe I'm not competent enough to answer that. So maybe maybe I'll just beg my ignorance and say that, I don't think I might be the right person to answer that question.
So in line with your last response, the next set of questions on Zoom, the first one says, I have read the report of the high-level committee where it stated that we have received 5,232 responses, out of which 3,837 have supported holding simultaneous elections, which the committee has considered to be nationwide support. Does getting 5,000 responses in a nation with a population of 150 crores indicate consensus? Should we make more efforts and move forward on this only with consensus? That's the first question. The second question is related, I think, Professor Shambabu, you were also sort of hinting when you said that about a presidential system of government. Related question is there any possibility that maybe by chance, one nation, one election becomes a tool for any authoritarian government? In long time, they establish one party rule and in the future, and it's a bit hard to understand, but regional parties become irrelevant. Corporates also appear to be more comfortable in many ways because they want their investment in only two national political parties and not regional political parties. And the third question in this set is the present mayhem and Manipur violence is related to political parties and elections. What could be our approach to address these vital questions?
Okay. So just a couple of factual things. I think data is important. And if you look at data of funding of political parties, it obviously shows that national parties receive outside support. But it also shows that regional parties also receive a decent amount of support. So I don't think it's completely out and out that if you're a regional party in power in a state, you'll receive more support than the regional party that is not in power in that particular state. And there is some data that has come from the electoral bonds that possibly supports that. So that's one part. I think the second part is while it is in any decision-making process, I think it's great to get as much feedback possible because it allows you to look at a problem from multiple lenses. But me and my colleagues, we look at Parliament very closely. And one of the things that we've noticed is sometimes there's a consensus on an issue that unites everybody, and they cannot agree then on the next possible topic. To give you a small example, there are legislation that get passed in less than 10 minutes because everybody agrees. But then there are legislation which are stalled. But just because, and this becomes important, right? So let's say there's a consensus on a particular law. Everybody agrees that this law should be passed. And then they say, let's not debate it, let's pass it. Now, what is the example that we are setting? What we are really saying is that just because political parties agreed on a particular subject, there was a consensus, we passed it, and there was no debate, we did not discuss as to what it meant. So I don't think consensus should be or would be the only mechanism as to how you think about a problem. Diwali is coming. I think everybody's consensus should be, let's consume as much sweets as possible. But I don't think, your doctor would quite agree with that proposition. So the consensus between you and your friends would be, let's have sweets. The differing opinion might be a much more valuable opinion to have. So yeah, I think in a country where we have to take decisions, we have to take decisions on evidence, data, and consensus can be one part of that decision-making matrix. I don't think it can be the only part of that matrix.
Yeah, that's it. That you should do.
Great. The last question is on Manipur. I think, again, I would humbly say that unlike many people who have graced, this distinguished position where I'm sitting, I may not have the best answers for Manipur. I might have some answers, but I don't think I should attempt an answer which is not in my realm of expertise and offer opinions that I might have read after consuming 5 newspaper editorials.
So one of the things, one nation, one election is us coming full circle. But on political financing, we've gone from one spectrum to the other. So as you brought out in your presentation that, during Indira Gandhi's time, they actually banned donations from corporates. And they passed the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, with which, of course, we're all very familiar, as a way of, stopping political funding from like foreign corporations and foreign entities. From that, we have come to a point where the electoral bond scheme, which no longer exists, but it existed for a few years, actually allowed contributions, not only allowed, it sort of legitimized contributions by corporates, including foreign corporates. And we've really come across the spectrum on corporate funding. That's the one thing I wanted to mention. And I wanted to sort of connect it with the larger discourse regarding one nation, one election, which is about the fact that we are interrupting governance. And this governance framework, which is there within policy institutions, and CPR is not an exception to that, is something that is also coming from what I would maybe suggest to you is a larger discourse around development, around the functioning of a country's economy, polity, and so on. Because we have policy agendas that are being set based on this governance framework, and not on like what the people want necessarily. Right. And so we have these sort of policy prescriptions that are coming that, okay, you have to implement these. I mean, one of the things that has been very controversial is the recent award of the Nobel Prize in economics. And one of the reasons why it has been very controversial is because this idea that, certain economic prescriptions, certain institutional prescriptions alone can bring about development in a country is being contested, because development or any kind of social good is a process of intense engagement, dialogue, contestation. Something that you have mentioned is that, like democracy or our participation as citizens is not just about elections, that it has to be deeper, more discursive, more deliberative throughout. And that is where we are also seeing a pushback against deliberative discourse with institutions, with civil society, with conversations that are facilitated by institutions. So can you also touch upon this move across the spectrum on corporate funding and this view of what democracy should mean vis-a-vis governance in your view, and what's the best way forward? And finally, just on anti-defection law, that this is something that, like I said, in the first assignment I had when I came and worked at PRS was in campaign finance, and the second one was on the anti-defection law. And what you have brought out in your conversation is that not only has the anti-defection law, gripped Lok Sabha and the direct election processes, but also now the indirect election processes. So instead of trying to make the member of parliament or member of state legislative assembly directly representative of the people, as opposed to just submitting to the political party, well, in the direct elections, now it's happening also in the indirect elections. And so, like you said, it's a council of political parties. So we've actually gone much worse on the anti-defection law. So what is the way forward, if I were to say these three questions, if I were to put to you?
So let's start with the first premise, which is democracy is not a clean, straight line. It's a messy squiggle. It will take time. It will be slow. It will be laborious. And perhaps, if I were to put it a little more succinctly, it is going to be a process which will take a really long time, even for smaller steps. Think of it as a massive ship which has to change course. It does not change course, at the push of a button. It takes, 5-10 kilometers to change 1 or 2 degrees or 5 degrees or whatever. So when we are thinking of governance discourse, that's part of the democratic setup that we have. And in our country's history, we have seen that whenever we've taken, or at least legislative decisions, which are very quick, we have kind of realized that some of them have worked well, but many of them we've had to, turn back, or we have to have rethink, or, do a little bit more work on it. Now, all of that comes at an opportunity cost. In a smaller country, let's say Singapore, you take a wrong decision and you take 6 months to correct it, doesn't, have as much of an impact. But in India, if you have to do policy corrections because you did something quickly, its scale of impact is massive. So I personally would rather go through a messy process of conversations, and I'd rather have that process delayed and get it right, or as right as possible, the first time around, and then hope that whatever little gaps had to be filled can be done subsequently. So that's one. So I think that's one part of it. That's how we should think of democracy. Democracy is never going to be clean. It is never going to be efficient, right? It is perhaps the most messy process there is, of getting everybody on the same page and then having to live with suboptimal outcomes. The next part is about electoral financing, and maybe I was too harsh when I said that we don't have to be so naive. But perhaps we are so naive, right? I mean, we think that, elections can be fought with savings that people have or have accumulated, or it can only be fought because somebody has the right mindset. So corporate funding of elections across the world happens. You can ban it, you can wish it away, but money will find a way of seeping into the electoral process one way or the other. So let's think of what is it that we should do. I think what we should be thinking about is how do we ensure that the funding that happens to political parties is as transparent as possible. Because what is our worry? Our worry is that monetary support to a political party should not impact the policy position that party government takes when it comes to power. So if you have clarity on who's giving how much money, then perhaps it guides us into holding that government accountable much more. So whatever steps that we can do towards that, I think will be really useful. Because in India, we've always taken this approach of banning something, and it'll never work. You can ban, whatever you ban becomes the most available thing that you can find. The last part is the anti-defection law is perhaps the single most threat to our democracy other than money and muscle power and those things. What this law is doing is it is reducing our public representatives from public representatives to just a vote pressing mechanism in parliament. They don't have an individual voice. They can't stand up for themselves. And ostensibly, the reason for the anti-defection law was to bring stability to governments. But stability of a government is tested only in Lok Sabha. Correct? But anti-defection law is also applicable in Rajya Sabha. No government falls because, you don't have the numbers in Rajya Sabha. It only falls when you don't have numbers in the road. So which makes me wonder, was the reason for the anti-defection law only to ensure stability of governments? Was it a much more larger thing? The other part is that the anti-defection law is applicable not only to the vote that you give in parliament, it is applicable to the speeches that you make outside of parliament. Then that makes me wonder as to, was the purpose only to ensure stability of government, or was the purpose to ensure control of representatives and make them more dependent on the whims and fancies of the party leadership? So what it has really done is it has reduced the democratic conversation between members of a political party and the party leadership. Because now a party leadership does not need to speak to its members. All they have to do is issue a whip. And I don't think any democracy or any political party can function very well purely on a whip system. It has to, democracy's question is democracy and dialogue go hand in hand. So if that dialogue or that inner party democracy stops because of the anti-defection law, it threatens the way our legislatures function, it threatens the way our legislators think. And I don't think for a vibrant democracy like ours, this is a law that has a place on the statute books, even on the constitution. So there are, and sometimes I'm in a minority on this thing, there are always suggestions to strengthen the anti-defection law so that you can control MPs and MLAs further. I think our MPs and MLAs have proved that given the right set of circumstances, they're immune to control. But the unintended consequences of the anti-defection law have ensured that, the debate in our legislatures has reduced. The quality of the deliberation has, changed. So perhaps it is time we need to rethink, that mechanism of control of our public representatives and let them free. Between 1985 and 2024, it's not as if governments haven't toppled. If the anti-defection law was such a panacea for ensuring stability of governments, we wouldn't have had that problem. But since it hasn't worked, maybe we should cut our losses and say, this is it. We've tried it for 35 odd years. It hasn't worked. We'll find something else to do.
Thank you, Chakshu. We're out of time, but one last question. Can you introduce yourself?
Arun, and from JNU, I'm pursuing my PhD in JNU. So I just want to make a comment on this corporate funding, that we are missing a point here, that in recent elections, we have seen a practice by the ruling government, especially, that they compile up the installments of beneficiary schemes like Kisan Nidhi and Ladli Behna Yojana, and they transfer the money directly to the accounts of the voters of that particular electorate or elections just before the elections. And if I'm not wrong, this time the election held on 5th of October in Haryana and Jammu and Kashmir. So the government transferred the installments of Kisan Nidhi on the same day of voting. So can we see it as a cash for vote?
I'd put a slightly more different lens to it. I think the courts will decide as to, how do we see that as. But if you're talking about imbalances in electoral practices, so to say, MPs and MLAs get 5 crores every year. I think MPs get 5 crores, MLAs, the amount differs. I think MPs might also. So whatever. So if you're an incumbent, you get an X amount of money that you can then direct towards developmental programs. Would you not say that that's also a little bit of an unfair, because it gives you an advantage over other competing candidates, because you had 25 crores to spend over 5 years or direct that money towards developmental goals. And then you can show your plaque will be everywhere all the developmental work is done. So when we are thinking about some of these issues in terms of parity when it comes to electoral practices, I think we should widen our net to include other things, to ensure that that free and fair part of the election process stays true. So I take your point as to what practices constitute free and fair practices. Maybe the Election Commission needs to rethink as to what they are.
Thank you, Chakshu. This was a vast topic to cover, and but I think we have discussed a wide range from the history of the first election, the spread of universal adult suffrage, to campaign finance, to anti-defection law, to the nature of governance, the nature of democracy itself. So I think that we have covered a vast ground, and I think if we are out of time, so we have to close this. But I think that the important takeaway from that I can see from what you've just spoken relates to one of the questions that came on Zoom, is that when we talk about the fear of authoritarian control, we shouldn't, in many ways, what's happening in the discourse in India today is there's a lot of distraction. So we have policy initiatives or conversations around certain issues, and yet the day-to-day functioning of our democracy is in many ways being impaired by various existing reforms or questions which haven't really been brought into the public discourse at all. And part of the reason for that is what you mentioned, is the fact that, if the Council of States has become the Council of Political Parties, if every political party is, the leadership is able to control all the members, within the leadership, there is no internal party democracy. These are the things that we also need to look at when we talk about the fear of authoritarianism, or the fact that democracy isn't functioning as well as it ought to be in India. And I think it's very important that citizens remain engaged, not just like, TV channels are also talking 24/7 about certain issues. And so it creates the impression that there's a lot of debate, but then there's a lot of control also, because the channels themselves are often controlled by corporates, about what issues can be brought up for debate. So many things just don't get covered at all. And what you are bringing out is that the same thing is happening in Parliament, the same thing is happening in the state legislative assemblies. And those are the real questions that we need to be focusing on, and less so much things like one nation, one election, for which we obviously have to have a full study. But there are many, many more things that we can do to improve our governance, to improve our democracy, and to ensure that when we became citizens overnight, that we actually enjoy and exercise that citizenship. Thank you so much to Chakshu, to our audience, very engaged audience, for your questions. And thank you also to Anshu and the LRI team, as well as Arnaz and the communications team at CPR for putting together this event. Thank you all.